Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are entering day 118 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And as continued fighting is taking place, we have some fairly significant developments. While there is not major territorial shifts at this point, I do believe at this point we are on the precipice of quite possibly seeing some major Russian advances taking place inside of the area of operation, especially near the Sloviansk-Severodonetsk Bakhmut triangle. Over the last 48 hours, we have seen a limited Russian maneuver operation, which it severed the main road from Lysychansk down in the south toward Zolat. So this main highway that runs from Lysychansk on down to Zolat has been severed by Russian forces, and it's more and more difficult for Ukrainian forces in this rapidly forming pocket to supply, for the Ukrainian forces to supply itself specifically in this area, and for all intents and purposes, the entire Sloviansk-Severodonetsk Bakhmut triangle is very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces to resupply itself, given the proximity and the amounts of Russian heavy artillery and multiple launch rocket systems that are being used against their forces. But specifically right now, what we'll do is we'll convert this over to the, but first we'll have a quick look at just kind of the last 24 hours on the map. And you can see the only real maneuver operations conducted by Russian forces was this, again, targeting that main north-south road towards Zolat. And we'll just back up and then forward, and you can see what they have done. And if we go over to the actual unit section, we can get an idea of the units that are involved in this ongoing operation. So difficult to say what Russian units are involved in this operation, but in terms of Ukrainian forces, it is a mixed bag. It consists of elements of the 17th Tank Brigade, the 118th Territorial Brigade, and the 112th Territorial Brigade. So you have roughly three plus brigades that are operating kind of in the environments just to the southeast of Lysychansk. And right now, obviously, this map is a bit different and hasn't been updated to show the Russians crossing and severing that main road south. But we do believe at this point the Ukrainian units that are predominantly in defensive positions near Zolat could be facing ultimately a complete envelopment, and then either a surrender or a possible destruction of the actual combat units that are operating in this area. Now, if we go and we look at another map that kind of gives you a better view. Now, obviously, all these maps show different types of territorial gains and who controls what. But again, we're kind of looking at the same map, but just a bit different in terms of territorial gains. And if you look down here near the defensive positions that have been set up near Zolat, it's going to be very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces. One, obviously, to resupply. They're facing almost a situation where at times you have direct line of sight between the two Russian fronts. The one front coming out of Popasna, and then obviously the other front kind of towards the northeast that is also progressing along the western bank of the Donets River. So the concept that the Russians have to do another forced river crossing is kind of a moot point at this point. They've already done that. and are continuing to advance on Lysychansk kind of from the southeast. So we may not see Russian forces progress, especially in the area near Severodonetsk, all the way to the Donets River on this side. One of the reasons for that is the ground on the western bank of the Donets River tends to be quite a bit higher. There are bluffs and terrain features that overlook areas into Severodonetsk and especially the east bank of the Donets River. So it probably would not be a prudent operation for the Russians to advance all the way to the Donets River, which would give Ukrainian forces the ability to have overwatch on those Russian forces. So in all likelihood, we will continue to see the Russians moving from the southeast along the western bank of the Donets River, attacking Lysychansk from the southeast, while at the same time we'll see Russian forces attacking the Ukrainian forces from the rear, or eventually completely enveloping the remaining sectors on the eastern bank of the Donets River and Lysychansk in its entirety at some point. But more importantly, right now, again, the Ukrainian forces, especially in this area, are in an incredibly precarious situation with Russian forces on both flanks and the ability of Russian forces to actually launch artillery attacks from their rear as well onto Ukrainian forces. Longer range, multiple launch rocket systems could be launched from the north of the positions located near Zalat and hit those forces. So again, just a very precarious situation right now for Ukrainian forces located in this area, and we're going to continue to watch this very, very closely in terms of what happens kind of going forward. And we have received reports, and there are indications that the Russians could be preparing for a major uptick in maneuver operations, especially in some of these areas that we have just talked about. So furthermore, kind of on a very, very similar but different topic, this isn't so much about the tactical situation occurring in the Donbass region, but more about what's happening with Lithuania, the European Union, and the Russian Federation. Obviously, as we had talked about in a previous episode, the Lithuanians have decided to cut off rail transport to Kaliningrad. And the Lithuanians are doing this under the guise of the sanctions that have been imposed upon the Russian Federation, and Lithuania is stating that any train transport coming in from Belarus, which would obviously originate from Russia proper, which then has to transport across Lithuanian territory and then enter Kaliningrad. Other than that, Kaliningrad only has the ability to then resupply itself either by air transport coming out of probably St. Petersburg and then coming all the way around, or direct ship transport as well. But the main means for Kaliningrad to receive very, very crucial supply for this area has been always through train transport. And right now, the Lithuanians are going to be inspecting the trains coming through for any what they would call contraband items that ordinarily would not be allowed to be shipped to Russia. Now you have to understand, again, these are Russian originating supplies. These are not exportable supplies that are on the way to Russia. These are Russian supplies basically going to Russia that have already been either produced or purchased in the Russian Federation. So a bit of a gray area there in terms of the possible legality on this issue, but right now, this is causing a massive increase in the stressors that could cause an outbreak of hostilities between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Russia, if Russia could possibly or would possibly look towards the military option to maintain its supply routes into Kaliningrad. And obviously, the Suwalki Gap has always been, and this is the area right here, this small area that separates Kaliningrad and from Belarus and Russia itself. I've seen obviously comments in the comment section that indicate that Russia just doesn't have the current capability to start a new conflict, especially with NATO-backed countries or active members of NATO. But you have to understand that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with NATO forces, limited NATO forces that are stationed in these states, would have a very, very difficult time in maintaining defensive operations against an all-out Russian attack or a rapid Russian move into the Baltic states. If you compare and contrast Ukraine with the Baltics, you really can't do that. I understand that when you look at Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, you immediately think of NATO capability. But the reality is, Ukrainian forces are much more of a challenge for Russian forces and a bigger obstacle as opposed to what Russian forces would see against the likes of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Ukrainian army at the start of this conflict exceeded 200,000 personnel with an industrial capacity and a very large defense sector and a what I would call a very well-trained military that had been fighting Russian proxy forces and Russian forces for many years. In the Baltic states, you have a much smaller force construct and a much lower population as well. In the realm of probably no more than 30,000 fighting personnel, active duty fighting personnel. Obviously, that would increase, but they have very limited, meaning Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they have very little in terms of heavy weapons. They have no tanks. And very, very few infantry fighting vehicles. And to say that you would see similar resistance, while you may see similar resistance in terms of motivational aspects of the Baltic states providing resistance against Russian forces, they do not have the same military capacity and capability that we see from Ukraine. So you're talking about a completely different scenario. Now, I do understand, yes, if NATO were to become involved, obviously we would have that immediate use of NATO air power, depending on which North Atlantic Treaty Organization member state would involve itself in the conflict. And again, that's another issue entirely to its own. Would we see the likes of Germany and other NATO nation states wanting to use its territory in a Baltic related conflict? And the answer to that, at least in our opinion at IMFAN, the answer to that is no. We do not believe Germany, we don't believe some other NATO states such as Turkey, Hungary would come to the aid of the Baltic states, and quite possibly if we saw a conflict erupt between the Russian Federation and the Baltic states, and if the NATO states did not agree to provide forces to come to the aid of the Baltics, and then we could rapidly see that organization, meaning NATO, completely fall apart. And then you would have a situation where you would have nations of the willing that would come to the defense of the Baltic states. But to the Baltic states would have a very tough time not being completely overwhelmed by Russian forces. Now, obviously, the likelihood of conflict is fairly remote, but at this point, I would say is increasing as we continue to see the political situation deteriorate. And these are more or less kinetic actions being taken by Lithuania in terms of cutting off the ability of Russia to supply Kaliningrad via train. So does Russia see this as some sort of active embargo against Kaliningrad by Lithuania? And could Russia legally articulate the need to forcefully lift that embargo? And that obviously would be something for the Kremlin to decide, and then obviously we would have to see some sort of military buildup take place, obviously before the Russians launched a operation into Lithuania to and obviously that operation would be to relieve Kaliningrad and open up supply routes. But in doing so, obviously, that would immediately cause conflict between Lithuania, a NATO member state, and Russia. So then I would have to say that Russia, probably in Russia's best interest in terms of the strategic situation, would have to then take control of both Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania to prevent a further NATO military buildup in the Baltic states. Obviously, if Russia seizes control of the Baltics, it becomes a much more challenging situation for NATO to then mass quite possibly in Poland. And that would be difficult unto its own, as the likelihood that Germany would support a direct military operation to retake the Baltic states, I would say at this point is fairly unlikely. The capability of the German armed forces, compounding that, is not in a state where it could go to war against the Russian Federation. Not just to mention the whole energy issue that Russia holds over Germany's head. But again, the German capacity to mount offensive operations and to conduct battle against Russian forces in the area such as Lithuania, Kaliningrad, and the Baltic Sea has been greatly degraded over the last few decades, as the Germans have not paid attention to maintaining its armed forces. So in all probability, those nation states willing to defend the Baltic states would be left to the United States, Poland, the United Kingdom, and maybe a few other nation states as well. But outside of that, I don't see a concerted NATO effort to protect the Baltic states. And then there you have a checkmate, basically, by Moscow on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because NATO is then no good if it cannot come to its obligations in terms of defending the Baltic states, which are NATO members. And probably not the best or wise strategic decision-making process to allow the Baltic states into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, giving the lack of attention to the military state of affairs, especially with some of these nation states that have not upkept their militaries in a manner that would allow them to protect and assist other NATO members. And again, just the whole strategic situation in the Baltics themselves, given the proximity and closeness to the Russian Federation, makes it very difficult for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to come to the aid of the Baltic states. But we'll continue to watch this very, very closely as it is continuing to really fall apart and is getting more and more out of hand day by day in terms of the relationships between the West and Russia. And obviously we have a hot war underway right now in the Ukraine, which hot wars, and especially the intensity of this hot war between Russia and Ukraine, there is a very good possibility this could escalate. And wars tend to escalate over periods of time. And we can look at past history, we can look at past world wars, and this is no different than those past wars. And I think we're quite possibly in the early stages of a global war, unfortunately. Anyway, that's kind of where we're at right now. We're going to continue to watch what is occurring very, very closely in the eastern Donbass. We think there could be some major territorial moves here fairly soon on the part of Russian forces launching a more expanded offensive operation. And we'll watch this very closely and obviously report as soon as we get more information. Again, thanks for joining us.